You have until tomorrow morning to leave, my mother-in-law said just hours after my husband was buried. No one at the table looked surprised. Not even my brother-in-law. Not even the relatives who had spent the entire afternoon telling me how sorry they were for my loss. I sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of me. My name is Margaret Hayes. I was 68 years old when my husband, William, passed away after 43 years of marriage. Until that evening, I believed grief would be the hardest thing I would ever endure. I was wrong. The funeral had ended less than 3 hours earlier. The flowers were still fresh. The sympathy cards were still stacked neatly on the entry table. William's coat was still hanging by the front door exactly where he had left it. Yet somehow, his family had already moved on to dividing what they believed was theirs. The dining room felt smaller than usual. The conversations had become colder. Every glance carried a meaning no one was willing to say aloud. Then Evelyn Hayes, my mother-in-law, finally said it. The house belongs to the Hayes family. It always has. Her voice was calm. Almost casual. As though she were discussing the weather instead of the home where I had spent most of my adult life. Richard Hayes, William's younger brother, nodded beside her. We'll have movers here tomorrow. It'll be easier that way. Easier. I looked around the room. Family photographs covered the walls. Pictures of birthdays. Christmas mornings. Summer barbecues. Decades of memories. Yet, in that moment, I felt like a stranger sitting inside someone else's life. William wanted me here, I said quietly. Richard shrugged. William isn't here anymore. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced at the cemetery. Nobody defended me. Nobody questioned what was happening. A few relatives lowered their eyes. Others suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. I realized then that these conversations had likely been happening long before that night. Plans had been made. Decisions had been reached. I simply hadn't been included. I stood slowly from my chair. My knees felt weak, but my voice remained steady. I think I need some air. No one stopped me. No one followed me. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of fresh rain. The sun was disappearing behind the trees across the street. William had always loved sunsets. He used to sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and tell me every ending carried the seed of a new beginning. At the time, I thought those words were comforting. Standing there alone, they felt impossible. I walked around to the side of the house and stopped. Several cardboard boxes were already stacked near the garage. My heart sank. I recognized my belongings immediately. Family photo albums. Winter coats. Books from my office. Someone had already started packing for me. I reached for the nearest box and brushed away a strip of tape. Whoever had done this expected me to disappear quietly. They expected grief to make me weak. They expected me to accept whatever they decided. As the last light faded from the sky, I stared at those boxes and felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Something colder. Something clearer. Because hidden beneath the top layer of belongings in that first box was an object I recognized instantly. An old silver flash drive that belonged to William. I carried the flash drive inside and closed the front door behind me. The voices in the dining room continued without me, low and confident, as if my future had already been settled. I slipped the drive into my sweater pocket and walked upstairs to the bedroom William and I had shared for more than 4 decades. The room felt untouched by the ugliness spreading through the house. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. A half-finished novel sat beside them. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the silence settle around me. Then I sat at his desk and turned on the old laptop he rarely used during his final year. The machine hummed to life slowly. My hands trembled as I inserted the flash drive. There was only one folder. It was labeled with a date from 8 months earlier. Nothing else. No explanation. No note. Just a date. I clicked it open. Several files appeared on the screen. Financial documents, Scanned letters. Property records. I frowned. None of it made immediate sense. William had always handled most of our paperwork. Not because he wanted control, but because he enjoyed organizing things. Every tax return, every insurance policy, every account statement ended up in carefully labeled folders. Looking at those files now felt like listening to a conversation that had started long before I entered the room. I opened one document after another. Some contained notes in William's handwriting. Others included highlighted passages and comments. The deeper I looked, the more confused I became. Several records referenced meetings I never knew had happened. There were notes about family trusts, company assets, and private discussions involving Richard. One scanned page had a sentence highlighted in yellow. If circumstances change unexpectedly, additional instructions will be provided separately. I read it 3 times. Additional instructions. Separately. My eyes moved back to the list of files. That was when I noticed something hidden at the bottom. A video file. My breath caught in my throat. The timestamp showed it had been recorded less than 3 months before William died. I stared at the screen for a long moment without clicking it. Outside the bedroom window, darkness had settled across the neighborhood. Porch lights glowed softly along the street. Somewhere downstairs I heard laughter. Richard's voice. Then Evelyn's. The sound felt wrong inside a house still filled with funeral flowers. I looked at William's photograph on the desk. The one taken during our anniversary trip to Maine 5 years earlier. He was smiling into the camera, his eyes bright despite the gray in his hair. Suddenly I remembered something he had said during one of his hospital appointments. We had been sitting in the parking lot afterward, watching rain slide down the windshield. He had reached over and squeezed my hand. "If anything ever feels wrong, promise me you will look deeper before you trust what people tell you." At the time, I thought he was talking about doctors and test results. Now I was not so sure. Downstairs, a door slammed. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Someone was moving through my home as though it already belonged to them. I closed the folder and removed the flash drive. Whatever William had left behind, I was not ready to watch it yet. Not while Richard and Evelyn were still downstairs. Not while I was still trying to understand what was happening. I slipped the drive back into my pocket and locked the bedroom door. Then, for the first time since the funeral, I began to wonder whether William had known exactly what his family was capable of. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I reached across the bed and felt the empty space beside me. The reality returned all at once. William was gone. His family was downstairs. And somewhere inside my sweater pocket sat a flash drive that suddenly felt more important than anything else in the house. I dressed quietly and opened the bedroom door. The smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen. When I walked downstairs, Richard was sitting at the table reading documents from a leather folder. Evelyn stood at the counter arranging plates as though she owned the place. Neither of them asked how I slept. Neither of them mentioned the funeral. Richard simply glanced up and said, "The movers will arrive around 10. I poured myself a cup of coffee. "That seems fast." He shrugged. "No reason to drag things out." I stirred my coffee slowly. The spoon clicked against the mug. Small sounds suddenly felt very loud. "I have not agreed to leave." Evelyn laughed softly. Not a warm laugh. Not a kind one. The sort of laugh people use when they think a conversation is already over. "Margaret, dear, this is not really your decision anymore." I looked at her. 43 years. I had spent 43 years attending holidays with this family. Bringing gifts. Hosting dinners. Remembering birthdays. Yet somehow I had become an outsider overnight. I carried my coffee into William's study and closed the door behind me. The room felt different from the rest of the house. Safe. Untouched. His framed diplomas still hung on the wall. His favorite fountain pen rested neatly beside a stack of yellow legal pads. I sat at his desk and opened the laptop again. This time, I reviewed the files more carefully. One document caught my attention immediately. It contained records from meetings between William and a woman named Laura Bennett. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Laura had been William's executive assistant for nearly 15 years before retiring. William trusted her completely. I continued reading. Several notes referenced concerns about asset transfers. Others mentioned requests for duplicate records. One line stopped me cold. Maintain backup copies outside primary family access. I stared at the sentence. Outside primary family access. Why would William write something like that? Unless he believed someone inside the family could not be trusted. My heart beat faster. For months I had blamed myself for missing signs. Maybe I had been too focused on William's health. Too focused on caring for him. But now pieces of a larger picture were beginning to emerge. A sudden knock startled me. Richard opened the study door without waiting for permission. Still going through old papers? He asked. His eyes swept across the desk. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw concern flash across his face. Then it disappeared. Just trying to understand everything William left behind, I replied. Richard smiled, but it never reached his eyes. There is not much left to understand. After he walked away, I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then I looked back at the screen. For the first time, I was certain of one thing. Richard was worried about something. And whatever it was, William had seen it coming long before any of us realized. After Richard left the study, I remained motionless for several minutes. The house felt strangely quiet despite the people moving through it. I looked again at the files William had saved. Every document seemed to point toward one conclusion. He had been preparing for something. Not illness. Not retirement. Something else. Something involving his own family. I opened another folder and found copies of emails dating back nearly 2 years. Most were routine business messages, but a few stood out. Several were exchanges between William and Laura Bennett. The tone was cautious. Professional. Careful. One message from William read, "Please keep duplicate records secured until I personally request them." Another said, "If circumstances change, Margaret must have access." I read that sentence over and over. Margaret must have access. He had written my name. Not Richard's. Not Evelyn's. Mine. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. About a year before William passed away, we had attended a family barbecue at Richard's house. It was a warm July afternoon. Children were playing in the yard. Music drifted from a speaker on the patio. Everything seemed normal. Yet now, looking back, I remembered William watching a conversation between Richard and one of his business associates. He had become unusually quiet afterward. Later that evening, while loading leftovers into the car, I asked him what was wrong. He smiled and said it was nothing. But it had not been nothing. Over the following months, there were other moments. Small moments. Easy to ignore at the time. Richard asking unusually detailed questions about company assets. Evelyn insisting on discussing inheritance planning during holiday dinners. William changing the subject every time. I had dismissed those incidents as ordinary family conversations. Now they felt different. Now they felt connected. A loud knock echoed through the house. Through the study window, I saw a moving truck pulling into the driveway. Right on schedule. Richard wasted no time. I watched 2 workers step out and begin unloading equipment. My stomach tightened. They were preparing to remove pieces of my life before I had even processed William's death. I left the study and walked downstairs. Richard stood near the front door greeting the movers. Evelyn sat comfortably in the living room, flipping through a magazine as though nothing unusual was happening. Neither one looked surprised to see me. "We are getting started with the guest rooms first," Richard announced. "That should make things easier." Easier for whom, I wondered. I said nothing. Instead, I picked up my purse from the entry table. "Where are you going?" Evelyn asked. I looked directly at her. "To get some answers." For the first time since the funeral, her confident expression wavered. Only slightly. But I noticed it. Outside, the morning air felt cool against my face. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel. Then I pulled out my phone and searched for a number I had not called in years. Laura Bennett. If William trusted her enough to leave traces of her throughout these files, then she might be the only person who knew what he had been trying to protect. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment. Then I pressed it. Laura answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, but steady. "Margaret?" she said immediately. "I was wondering when you might call." I tightened my grip on the phone. "You were expecting me?" A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Careful. "William told me that if certain things happened, you would eventually reach out." I looked through the windshield at the moving truck parked in my driveway. Workers were carrying boxes across my lawn while Richard supervised from the front porch. "I think those things are happening," I said quietly. Laura sighed. "Then we need to talk in person." 40 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop on the edge of town. Laura was already there, seated near the window with a folder resting beside her. When she saw me enter, her expression softened. For a moment, I saw genuine sadness in her eyes. Not the performative sympathy I had received from relatives during the funeral. Real grief. The kind that comes from losing someone respected and loved. We sat together in silence before either of us spoke. Finally, Laura slid the folder across the table. "William asked me to keep these." Inside were copies of documents I had never seen before. Meeting notes. Correspondence. Asset inventories. Every page carried William's meticulous handwriting. "Why did he not tell me?" I asked. Laura folded her hands. "Because he hoped he was wrong." Those words settled heavily between us. "Wrong about what?" Laura looked directly at me. "Richard." The name hung in the air. I felt my stomach tighten. Laura continued carefully. "About 18 months ago, William discovered several unusual requests involving company records and family trusts. Nothing illegal. Nothing obvious. But enough to concern him. She opened one of the files and pointed to several highlighted sections. William began documenting everything. Quietly. He did not want a confrontation. He wanted facts. I turned pages slowly. The deeper I looked, the more I recognized William's methodical approach. Dates. Notes. Questions. Cross-references. He had been building a record. Not out of anger. Out of caution. "There is more," Laura said. "Much more." She reached into her purse and removed a small envelope. My name was written on the front in William's handwriting. The sight of it nearly stole my breath. I traced the letters with my fingertips. Laura smiled sadly. "He told me to give that to you only if you started asking questions." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single note. Short. Simple. Unmistakably William. "Margaret, if you are reading this, trust your instincts. Not every truth is written on paper. Some things must be seen. Follow the evidence. Then watch the recording." I read the message twice. Then a third time. When I looked up, Laura was watching me carefully. "The recording?" I whispered. "You know about it?" Laura nodded. "Yes. And if William wanted you to watch it, then whatever is on that video is probably the reason some people are moving so quickly right now." Outside the coffee shop window, clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. For the first time since William's funeral, the confusion was beginning to fade. In its place was something stronger. Purpose. And deep down, I knew I was getting closer to the truth than Richard ever expected. Laura and I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every document William had left behind. By the time we finished, the coffee in our cups had gone cold. The folder contained far more than financial records. It contained a timeline. William had documented conversations, meetings, and decisions stretching back nearly 2 years. At first glance, none of it seemed dramatic. A request for information here. A discussion about trust assets there. But together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Richard had been positioning himself for control long before William became seriously ill. He had pushed for access to company records. He had asked questions about ownership structures. He had repeatedly suggested changes to long-standing family arrangements. William had noticed every single one. He never stopped paying attention, Laura said quietly. I nodded. That sounded exactly like William. Even during difficult times, he observed more than people realized. I looked down at one page covered with handwritten notes. Beside a paragraph discussing company assets, William had written a single sentence in the margin. If something happens to me, Margaret must know the full picture. My throat tightened. For weeks I had felt abandoned. Now I was discovering that William had spent months trying to protect me. Not with promises. Not with speeches. With preparation. Laura reached into her folder again and produced another document. There is one more thing you need to see. It was a list of storage accounts and backup archives. Several were unfamiliar to me. One entry was highlighted. Secure Family Archive. Access restricted. Authorization required. My eyes widened. What is this? Laura gave a small smile. A private archive William created. He wanted copies of important records stored somewhere no one else could alter or remove. Suddenly the message in his letter made sense. Follow the evidence. Then watch the recording. The evidence was leading somewhere very specific. We spent the rest of the afternoon contacting administrators, verifying credentials, and recovering access information. The process was slow. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Yet with each step, the picture became clearer. William had anticipated resistance. He had anticipated confusion. He had even anticipated attempts to pressure me into leaving before I understood what was happening. As evening approached, my phone rang. Richard. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Where are you? He asked immediately. Out. The movers finished most of the downstairs. His voice sounded irritated. We need to discuss next steps. I looked through the coffee shop window. The sun was beginning to set. I am not ready to discuss anything. Silence. Then a forced laugh. Margaret, there is really nothing left to figure out. I thought about the documents spread across the table. The hidden archive. The flash drive in my purse. The note written in William's hand. I think there is quite a lot left to figure out, I said. Before he could respond, I ended the call. Laura studied me carefully. That sounded different. I slipped the phone back into my purse. What did? She smiled. You. For the first time since the funeral, I realized she was right. The frightened widow they expected was beginning to disappear. And somewhere inside a secure archive that William had protected for years, a final piece of the truth was waiting for me. The following morning, Laura called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. Her voice carried a level of urgency I had not heard before. We got in, she said. For a moment, I did not understand. Then I remembered the archive. I set my coffee down immediately. What did you find? There was a brief pause. I think you should see it yourself. An hour later, we were sitting together in a small conference room at the office of an independent records administrator. The building was plain and forgettable, the kind of place people passed every day without noticing. Yet inside that room, pieces of my entire future were waiting. A technician opened the archive and began organizing the contents. There were hundreds of files. Financial statements. Legal correspondence. Ownership records. Backup copies of agreements I had never known existed. Everything was carefully indexed. Everything was dated. Everything reflected William's habit of documenting details most people overlooked. As we reviewed the materials, one fact became impossible to ignore. Many of the assumptions Richard had been presenting as facts were completely unsupported by the actual records. Several assets had different ownership structures than he claimed. Certain accounts were protected by provisions I had never heard him mention. Some family arrangements appeared far more complicated than anyone had admitted. Laura looked at me across the table. William was preparing for a challenge. I nodded slowly. And he expected it to come from inside the family. The technician continued searching through the archive. Then he stopped. There is another folder here. My attention sharpened immediately. The folder carried a simple label. Final instructions. Nobody spoke as it was opened. Inside were several documents and a media file. The same file name I had seen on the flash drive. The recording. My pulse quickened. After days of searching, questions, and uncertainty, we were finally staring directly at the thing William had wanted me to find. Yet I did not press play. Not immediately. Instead, I studied the screen. The timestamp showed it had been created just weeks before his final hospitalization. Laura remained silent beside me. She understood. This was not merely a file. It was William's voice waiting on the other side of a button. A technician asked softly, "Would you like to view it now?" I thought about Richard. About Evelyn. About the movers. About the confidence they had shown while pushing me aside. Most of all, I thought about William's note. Follow the evidence. Then watch the recording. He had written those words for a reason. Not yet, I said. Both Laura and the technician looked surprised. I closed the folder carefully. If this recording contains what I think it does, then everyone needs to see it. Laura's expression changed. Understanding replaced surprise. You want witnesses. I want the truth heard by the same people who have been speaking for William ever since he died. As we gathered the documents, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. The fear was fading. The confusion was fading. For the first time, I felt something close to certainty. Whatever was inside that recording had worried William enough to protect it. And if Richard had been working this hard to rush me out of my own life, then somewhere deep inside that video was the answer to a question nobody wanted me to ask. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Laura handled the arrangements carefully. Invitations were sent to everyone who had been involved in the discussions surrounding William's estate. Richard attended. Evelyn attended. The family attorney attended. Several relatives came as well. Most of them appeared curious. A few looked annoyed. Everyone assumed this was another administrative meeting before the final transfer of assets. I arrived early and took a seat near the end of the conference table. The room was quiet at first. Then people began filing in. Richard entered carrying the same confidence he had worn since the funeral. He greeted relatives, shook hands, and settled comfortably into his chair. Evelyn sat beside him. Neither one seemed concerned. Neither one asked why I had called for the meeting. They acted like people who believed the outcome had already been decided. Laura arrived a few minutes later carrying a laptop and several folders. She gave me a small nod but said nothing. Across the table, Richard noticed the folders and frowned slightly. The expression vanished almost immediately. By the time the attorney called the meeting to order, every seat was occupied. Margaret requested this gathering before any further estate actions are finalized, he explained. Richard leaned back in his chair. I am sure we can clear up whatever confusion remains. His tone was polite. Almost patient. The same tone people use with someone they believe is struggling to understand reality. I looked at him calmly. That is exactly why we are here. The room fell silent. Laura connected the laptop to a large display screen mounted on the wall. Several relatives exchanged curious glances. Richard's smile faded slightly. What is this? He asked. Laura answered before I could. A recording. Nobody spoke. The words seemed to settle over the room like a sudden change in weather. Richard shifted in his chair. A recording of what? I folded my hands together. William. For the first time, genuine uncertainty appeared on his face. Not panic. Not fear. Just uncertainty. Evelyn turned toward him. He avoided her eyes. The attorney adjusted his glasses and looked at the screen. I was not aware a recording existed. Neither was I replied. Until recently. The room grew very still. Outside the conference room windows, afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody reached for their phones. Nobody whispered. Every person in that room understood they were about to hear the voice of a man who was no longer there to speak for himself. Laura positioned the cursor over the video file but did not press play. Instead, she looked toward me. Waiting. Giving me the choice. My eyes moved around the room one final time. Richard stared at the screen. Evelyn gripped the edge of the table. Several relatives leaned forward slightly in their chairs. The attorney appeared completely focused. For days, everyone had spoken on William's behalf. They had explained what he supposedly wanted. They had explained what he supposedly intended. They had explained why certain decisions supposedly made sense. Now none of that mattered. Because in a matter of seconds, assumptions would no longer be necessary. I took a slow breath and nodded to Laura. Her finger moved toward the keyboard. As the video window expanded across the screen, William's image appeared frozen in the opening frame. And suddenly, nobody in the room looked confident anymore. The room remained silent as the recording began. William appeared seated behind the desk in his study. He looked older than I remembered, thinner too, but his eyes were clear and focused. For a moment, seeing him again made it difficult to breathe. Then he smiled gently at the camera. "If you are watching this," he began, "it means I am no longer able to speak for myself." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Every person in that room was listening. William continued calmly. "I created this recording because I believe clarity is a gift, especially when confusion benefits certain people." Across the table, Richard lowered his eyes. Laura remained perfectly still. The attorney leaned forward slightly. William explained how he had spent months reviewing family assets, company records, and estate plans. He described concerns that had grown over time. Not accusations. Not anger. Just facts. Dates. Decisions. Documents. Everything presented with the same careful precision that had defined his entire life. Then he addressed the issue directly. "My wife, Margaret Hayes, is and always has been my primary beneficiary. Any suggestion otherwise is incorrect." A ripple moved through the room. Small. Almost invisible. Yet impossible to miss. William continued. "Over the last 2 years, I became aware of efforts to influence decisions regarding family assets. For that reason, duplicate records, ownership confirmations, and supporting documentation have been stored independently." My eyes shifted toward Richard. The color had drained from his face. William was not finished. He explained the archive. The backups. The safeguards. Every precaution he had quietly put into place. Then he looked directly into the camera. "If anyone attempts to pressure Margaret, remove her from her home, or misrepresent my intentions, this recording serves as my response." The silence deepened. Even the air in the room felt different. William's expression softened slightly. "Margaret, if you are watching this, there is something I need you to know." My hands tightened together. "You spent 43 years building a life with me. You stood beside me through every success and every setback. You never asked for recognition. You never demanded credit. But none of what we built would have existed without you." Tears filled my eyes, but I did not look away. Neither did anyone else. "This home is yours. The assets protected for our future are yours. Most importantly, your place in this family is not something anyone else has the authority to grant or remove." He paused briefly before continuing. "People reveal their character when they believe there will be no consequences. If this message is being played, then certain truths have likely revealed themselves already." The video ended a few moments later with a simple goodbye. No dramatic final words. No grand gesture. Just William being William. Honest. Thoughtful. Certain. When the screen went dark, nobody spoke. Richard stared at the table. Evelyn looked as though she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The attorney slowly removed his glasses and exhaled. Laura reached over and gently squeezed my hand. For days I had felt erased. For days I had watched people speak over me, dismiss me, and tried to rewrite my place in my own life. But William had seen it coming. He had prepared for it. And even after he was gone, he had found a way to stand beside me one final time. As I walked out of that conference room later that afternoon, I realized something important. The greatest thing William left behind was not the house. It was not the assets. It was not the documents. It was the truth. And unlike everything else, that was something nobody could ever take away.